Hi Spring fans, and welcome to another installment of Spring Tips. In this hopefully very quick installment, we're going to take a look at some ways to make your organization and your code more consistent. And I know that's a particularly odd angle to approach this, but what I find is, and what most artists have discovered, is that constraints give you freedom, right? Being forced to work within the constraints of a particular system allows you more flexibility in other parts of the system. It frees you to think about the things that actually matter. And so Spring Boot is really amazing because it gives you this impression of being completely free to do whatever you want, while also providing ample guardrails. Right? These guardrails help you stay on the right path as you are working on the code and as you're building systems. And this is particularly important for large organizations. So what we're going to talk about today are just some things that I find that are helpful to make it easier for people to build services and applications that scale, right, in the large, in terms of people, not in terms of they do scale in terms of API requests, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about as an organization, can your software scale? And so we're going to just talk about a few things that help you with that. And we're going to start with some obvious things and maybe some small things that you haven't seen before. Okay. Now, today we're going to start by building a simple application demo. Okay, and we're going to just use Spring Boot 2.20 M3. I'm going to bring in a few different dependencies. I'll bring in the configuration processor. Right. There it is. I'm going to bring in Lombok. Okay. And what else? What else do we want? I think that's probably it, right? So we'll hit generate. Seems right to me. Yeah, okay, we'll do that. Just a very simple application. Nothing particularly interesting here. We'll open this up. Downloads, demo, idea, pom.xml. So we're building a brand new application, and we're going to do something as trivial as possible. We're going to see that I'm not actually demoing a particular thing. I'm demoing things you can do with Spring. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to build an application that prints out a random number. Not a big deal, but we can do it, right? So let's do that. Okay. There it is. Okay. Gotta make sure we have the latest and greatest here. Alright, so now we have a very simple application. Let's say that we want to build an application that when it starts up, it injects a service that then number service, whatever. Very simple, very trivial, obviously pointless thing. Okay, so we're gonna have, let's see, void generate random. Okay, whatever. I don't think I'm under no pretense about this being something you'd need to write, but it'll demonstrate a few things for us. So private final thread local random new, or is it just thread local random dot get current? There you go. Okay. Actually, you would probably just want to call that each time. So you'd say, okay, there you go. And we're going to say thread local random dot int or next int. Okay, and we're going to use a bound. Okay, so we're going to create a bound here, and the bound, let's say that's parameterizable. It's something that we want to have specified when the application starts up, and we'll specify that here, and it'll be something that we create in the constructor. Okay, so it'll be a thing that we can inject through a property, and then there we go. Alright, so now we return this, and we'll say next. Okay, good stuff. Alrighty. So we've got now a very simple application. All we're doing is specifying this bound. Why doesn't this seem happy? Oh, no beans of type. Yeah, it's not a bean. So we're going to have to specify this. We're going to provide a value. Okay. So it's going to come from a property somewhere. Something is going to configure this bean with a value. Okay, so I'm going to, I guess I could put it in a property, in a string, but one thing that I want is I want this thing that produces a value to use a property to look up that object. So a very common approach here is to extract that out. Let's say I wanted this to be, I want this to be numbers dot, random dot bound. Okay, or better yet, keep it simple, just numbers dot bound. So that's a property that I'm expecting from the Spring Framework environment, and that means that I could put it in the environment, literally as an environment variable, numbers underscore bound, etc. It could be here equals 10. I can do whatever I want, but this is a string, right? You're hoping that when you extract this from the environment that it is actually an int, and Spring will have no problem coercing it. But you don't know, right? There's no guarantee there. And also, when you type this, there's no sense that this property exists. You don't know if it's there or not. And so a very common thing to do is to create a configuration processor. Is to use a configuration processor to define configuration properties. So let's say class number properties. Okay, and I'm going to say private int bound. We'll just use Lombok here. Good. And we're going to say at enable configuration properties, number properties dot class. Okay, so there we go. And what we're doing is we're telling Spring, hey, I want to create an object that has these properties bound to things in the environment. So I'm going to say that this is going to use the prefix called numbers. So it'll say numbers dot bound. So now when Spring starts up, it's going to when I compile the code, so that's what I'll do here. I'll invoke the terminal and do a Maven clean install or Maven clean package. Okay. Good stuff. So there it is. So now, notice that the gray, the highlight behind this has gone away, right? Make sure we're all on the same page here to make this font a little bit bigger. There we go. 26. So you can see that it says numbers.bound equals 10, and you can see the property is now defined in this object. This object is using a Lombok, so it has getters and setters and all that stuff, right? I can inject number properties, and I've got getters and setters. So all that is there. It's based on this property. I can now just inject this here as an object. It's a bean, right? Spring is actually going to create a bean of this object. And so rather than having this stringly reference thing here, I can say np, and then I'll say np.getBound, right? So there we go. I've done a couple things here. I've created a number service, completely pointless, and I've created some properties to define that number service. All right, so now I can inject this number service somewhere and use it. Okay, so number demo. And I'm going to inject the number service here. Create a constructor, event listener, application ready event, public void run. And then this dot number service dot generate random number, and I just want to log out the data, so I'll say at component at log4j. Okay, and random number. All right, I'm going to say log.info random number equals random number. That is a completely pointless demo. I think we can agree. It's absolutely fair to say that. But what have we done? We've created two objects. One is a configuration properties that holds properties from this property file. So now, let's say I want to type this again. Well, now if I go to the property file, application.properties, and I hit control space, that configuration processor that we added to the build here, this thing here, Spring Boot configuration processor, that's actually generating an indexed file. And the indexed file is being used at runtime by the IDE. It's an index file that has JSON. It's basically a JSON structure that gets stored in the build, and that is being used by the IDE to assist it in auto-completing, for example, this. Right? I can say numbers bound equals 10, and you can see when I command click on this, when I highlight and hover over this and command click on it, it takes me to this object. Right? It navigates to this configuration properties object. So it knows about this object, and the mechanism that we're doing this, we built this generically. It's in Spring Boot proper. It's not a feature of IntelliJ only. So you can use it in NetBeans, you can use it in the Spring Tool Suite. So it's just a very good way for developers to very easily consume your application and consume configuration. Now, in this case, I've here's my, if you will, my client, the thing that's using the infrastructure, the service, and the properties that I've configured. And here's the actual configuration itself, the thing that I want, right? I've got the producer and the consumer in the same code page. Nominally, these things are maybe they live in the same code page, but they might even just live in separate packages. But let's suppose that I actually wanted to reuse this number service and this configuration across multiple jars for whatever reason. Obviously, this is a demo, just indulge me, okay? So if I want to reuse this, I'd like to extract that out into a library. Okay, so let's go back to the initializer, and we're going to create a numbers, okay? And we're going to create a numbers auto configuration, okay? So here we're going to have Lombok and the Spring configuration processor, and that's it. We're going to hit generate, and all we're doing is we're creating a new jar. And we go back here, UAO numbers auto configuration. Okay, and so what I'm doing is I'm gonna this is a Spring Boot app, but I want this as a library. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna delete all that. Okay, new package. Package numbers. I'm going to create a numbers auto configuration. Okay, numbers auto configuration. And it's going to be a class that Spring Boot will start up. And in that configuration, we're going to register a bean of type number service. Okay, so we need to have this here. Okay, and we don't want to rely on class path scanning, so I'm going to take off this service annotation there, and I'll just do @bean. Okay. Now, same problem. I need the pointer to the number properties itself. Okay, so I'll pass that in. All right. So now I've registered this bean to a configuration, and now what I want is for this configuration to get registered whenever somebody has this library on the class path. So this is easy. I'm going to go to the resources directory. I'm going to create a new directory here called metainf, and I'll create a new file in there called spring.factories. And here, I'm going to use an attribute. This is a service loader mechanism in Spring. Okay, so resources metainf spring.factories is going to result in this. It's going to look up these files in all the different jars. It's going to find this attribute, and here I can just list any auto configuration that I want it to care about. So I'm going to create this one. I'm going to copy the reference to this. Go to my spring.factories, and there we are. Okay, so now I've told it about my numbers auto configuration, and now I want to consume this dependency in my code, right? So I'm going to what am I going to do? I'm going to get rid of the stuff that makes this a so-called fat jar, an application. I'll get rid of all that. I don't want that. I'm going to leave in this stuff. I'm going to leave in the Spring Boot starter. Now, normally, in this case, you wouldn't want your starter, your dependency, your auto configuration, to in turn specify the version of Spring Boot. It shouldn't manage that, right? It shouldn't insist upon that. So you might actually, in this case, want to bring in the Spring Boot BOM, the bill of materials. That way you're actually bringing it in as another dependency. It has the effect of level setting your dependency versions without having any effect on the tree being used by the people who are consuming your library. But I'm going to just keep it simple because I don't want to have to specify things like the compiler plugin and all that stuff. So I'll leave this all here. But there's good documentation on the specifics of what you would do here. So Spring Boot Starter wiki, how to, there's a there you go. Spring Boot starters. So these are starters. Let's see, creating out. There you go. There you go. So when you create starters, there's 2 bits, right? There's the actual auto configuration. That's what we're doing right now, and then there's the starter dependency. But when you create your own starter, do not start your module names with Spring Boot. So because that way it's easier for people who are using Maven. That way they don't discover your thing by accident. They don't actually autocomplete Spring Boot hyphen your API when we might do the same thing in the future, right? So that's a very convenient thing, right? Okay, so we're gonna avoid doing that. Right now we're creating an auto configure module, right? Actually, I named it auto configuration. Let's just name it auto configure. Okay, so auto configure, and I'm gonna call this numbers. Okay, or Spring tips. There you go. Numbers auto configure, and so this has the dependencies that we want. We've got the configuration processor. Okay, we need the Spring Boot starter dependency, and that's it, right? And that's, I think, the basic setup. One configuration metadata. Okay, so we're going to call this this is the auto configure dependency, right? This is the dependency that has our auto configuration. The reason that there's a distinction between an auto configuration jar and a starter is that the starter brings in the dependencies that are required to make this work, whereas the auto configuration has the code. So in this case, in theory, I could create more dynamic auto configuration. Let's say that I have, let's say that for some reason we're on a JVM that doesn't have thread local random. Okay, so I could say, okay, conditional on class thread local random dot class. And what that means is that this configuration would only activate if that type was on the class path. That would actually stop this from being registered, right? It would stop the configuration class, etc., from being registered. And that's very useful. You can create very dynamic applications. So you can say, if this library, which you are testing, whose presence you're testing for by virtue of the fact that this class is implied by the dependency, if that class is on the library, then register these beans, okay? So in our code, of course the classes are on the library class path, but they don't need to be, right? What's a silly example that I can bring in? Let's say that I register a dependency here using Spring Web Flux, okay? So I'm going to use the reactive Spring Boot Starter Web Flux, okay? And I'm going to make this scope optional is true, okay? So I'm bringing this dependency, it's compiled against my code, and now I'm going to register another bean. I'm going to say @bean router function, okay? Or maybe it's scope provided. There you go. Okay, let that build. Maven. Okay, restart. Come on. Router function. There we go. Server response. Whoa, whoa, whoa. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm creating a functional reactive endpoint, and it'll just serve up the number dot get number new handler function, and I'm going to use this number service here. Okay, so I'm using a reference to that. I'll say server response dot OK dot sync body ns dot generate random number. Okay, and we can actually do a singleton map number. Alrighty, so there we go. We've got now a singleton map. We've got a random number. Add this there. Okay, so now I've got a random number. Now, do I want this functionality all the time? Maybe the users of my library won't have Spring Web Flux on the class path. So I could say conditional on class, what's the thing? I guess router function, right? Router function is a type that may not be there. So this bean will only be registered if this type is true. And we're not assuming it's true. So if you use our dependency, numbers auto configure in your code, then this won't be activated by default unless you also bring in Spring Boot Starter Web Flux. So let's try this out. Let's go to our console here. Okay. Maven install. Let's see, which file? Oh, my tests. You should definitely write tests, but I don't have time. Maven clean install. Alright, so that's now installed. Now I want to reuse this functionality. So let's go see what happens if I bring that in to my other application. Over here, I'm going to go to my build and bring in that auto configuration. Okay. Good. So there's this, and the version is probably the same one as up here, right? Because I don't think I changed it. Right, so there we go. Okay, so there's that. So now I'm bringing in the auto configuration. I changed the package when I wrote this code, so let's make sure we comment out that type. Goody. Maven re-import number service. There it is. So copy a reference to this. Package numbers. Import. Right. Did I make the type not public? I think I did. Oh no. So number auto configuration. Okay, public. Okay, good stuff. So now we install all that. Go back to here. There you go. The types are now public. So now I can inject the bean, right? And I don't configure. There's no place in this code where I'm actually configuring that dependency. Why is it still unhappy? Is this method not public? Oh, Josh, don't take the lazy way. Okay. There we go. So now we go back here. There we go. So now it's public as well. So now I can run the same code without having to without having to configure those dependencies. Now, if anybody wants to reuse this basic behavior, right? Whoops, class not found. Router function. Oh, so it's trying to load this because it has the class in the method. What I should have done is I need to cordon this off into a nested configuration. So I can say static class web config, and that way it's not gonna, it'll load the outer class and not the inner one, right? So public static, there we go. And I want this to be only loaded, I want the nested class to be loaded only if this type router function is on the class path. Okay. Should restart. Okay, so there you go. It started up and there's no error because it didn't try loading the web endpoint. But I want that web endpoint. And so this is where we get into the concept of a starter. So you can see that I have two modalities in my auto configuration. I've got the default modality, which is like the set of beans that are run and evaluated by default when you start the application. And I've also got this web modality, this web sort of behavior that runs only if there's a certain package on the class path, or a certain module on the class path. And so I want to be able to support or export that functionality to the world. And the way you do that is you create your own starter dependency. So I've got an auto configuration dependency. You can create a starter dependency as well, and a starter dependency just brings in the things that you want to be able to activate certain bits of functionality. You can see that we do this in Spring Boot all the time. So we say Spring Boot, what's a good thing? Spring Boot starter web, right? That jar is otherwise basically empty. There's nothing in it, right? The jar itself doesn't have any functionality except for a Maven POM. This POM, in turn, specifies, that we need these libraries to make up the support for WebFlux. So it brings in Spring Boot Starter, brings in the WebFlux support, etc., etc., etc. So you can create your own Maven Starter, and you make sure you don't name it with Spring Boot. It has to be like, your group ID, and then for the artifact ID, numbers, Spring Boot Starter, not Spring Boot Starter numbers, right? That would bring in only the correct versions of the dependencies that you want. So again, you might use the Maven BOM there, the Maven Bill of Materials dependency, and you might say, I want to have numbers, Spring Boot Starter, web, right? And so that would be if somebody brought that in, there's no Java code in there. It would only have the effect of transitively forcing Maven to add Spring Boot Starter WebFlux to your application, so that, and it would also bring in the numbers auto config. It would bring in this auto configuration, and it would bring in Spring Boot Starter WebFlux, so that you would have everything you would need to run this configuration class, right? So we can kind of shortcut that process. We can actually go to our demo and explicitly add in WebFlux to activate that functionality. So there we are. Now we've done the same thing. Now that condition will evaluate to true. We can restart this. Okay, so you can see that the application's up and it hasn't shut down. It hasn't stopped because it's still running, because we created an endpoint. So I think it's called number. There you go. Okay, so we created a REST endpoint dynamically based on auto configuration, and that we didn't have to write any code on the client side as we use that to do that. So this is this building of a starter, building of auto configuration, building of auto configure modules. This promotes reusability across the organization. It's a very useful way to ensure that you have consistency across your different teams in the organization. You might extract out things like your security configuration into a separate jar. You might extract out things like logging and auditing and things that you want done a consistent way across the organization, right? Maybe the way you configure connection pools for your particular legacy DB2 instance or something like that, whatever, right? These things are all sort of up to you to decide. Okay, now the work I've done so far covers, I think, we've looked at a lot of different things here, and we've looked at a couple things. We've looked at the auto configuration. We've looked at building your own auto configuration jars and starters. We looked at all these kinds of things that you could do for a while. The next, I think the logical next step that a lot of people don't take is that you can actually build your own Spring initializer, right? So let's say that I had gone through the process of building a starter, which is just, as I say, just a Maven POM that brings in your auto configure and it brings in the prerequisites required from the ambient, dependencies out there, Spring Boot Starter, WebFlex, and so on. Let's say I'd done that. Now I want to have my own dependency on the initializer, right? Start.spring.io. Well, you could work with us, and through a very, very lengthy process, we can add your dependency here if you've established that there's a large community, that it's open source, that it gets consistently maintained. But if you just want to have your own initializer for your own organization, so start.yourorganization.io, then we can do that, right? And you can do that yourself. You don't need anything special from us. So you can go to github.com, spring.io, and you'll see that Spring Initializer is actually a generator. First of all, it's an API that's represented by this project here, Spring.io Initializer. And then there's a particular customized implementation of it called start.spring.io. That's this thing here. And that's the start client and the start site. And this is actually the integration with that generator. That generator is generic. It doesn't have to be used for Springs, and the user interface doesn't have to look like ours, right? It can, and if you want it to look like ours, you can clone this. This is Apache 2 licensed, open source. Please use it. And so I've got this cloned on my local machine here, right? SSDI start. I should show you this. Nope. There we go. It's start client and start site, and I even have that open here in my IDE. Okay, and so what you need to know is that this has the two projects, start client, start site, and the only thing I've done is I've gone and I've gone to this property file called application.yaml. And application.yaml is where we customize the look and feel of the generator. It's actually where we provide the different dependencies that belong here, right? So you can see this is actually a fairly deep, hundreds and hundreds of lines of YAML that configures all the different jars, the checkboxes, the bill of materials dependencies that are assumed there, all that stuff, right? So Java versions, the Maven, the Gradle, all that stuff that could be specified, we specified here, right? And there are customizations as well, Java code that maybe you don't care about, maybe you don't want. You can get rid of them, you can add them, you can remove them. So for example, we have there's certain things that require other work. It's not just as simple as choosing a checkbox. So for example, we customize the Gradle build if you add dev tools, for example, or if you customize the Maven build if you add the dev tool. So some things are not dynamic. There's not a one-to-one correlation, for example. So these are things that get added to your build, but are not quite as simple as just taking the configuration of the property file and then emitting a dependency, right? It actually requires a bill of materials. It requires that other libraries be there or whatever, and you can express all these things through these different customizers. Okay, so I don't want to. We could and should do a whole episode on just how to customize this, but suffice it to say, most of your work will be here. So what I've done is I've gone and I've created a arbitrarily named Bootiful Section, okay, for a fictitious library called Golong, and the ID is called Golong. Now I'm going to actually change this. So we've got Golong. We've got our auto configuration. You shouldn't put your auto configuration here. It should be the starter dependency, okay? But just so we have something we can look at, let's try it out. So numbers auto configuration, st numbers auto configure. Okay, taking all that, taking that to here, and okay, so it's ID, group ID is st, and this is going to be called here, and snapshot. Okay. Random. All right, so there we go. I've got my random number dependency added to this initializer, and I'm going to customize. I'm going to run it by going to the start site on the command line here. So I'll say terminal cd start site Maven Spring Boot run. Okay. And now if I go to localhost 8080, oh, did I have a... Oh, let's just assume I have a release version here. 1.2.0.release. Okay. Oh, I've got something else in port 8080. Oh, of course I did. Close that one out. Run that again. There we go. So, it's downloading some metadata the first time. There we go. So now there's our 2.0. We can say I want to see all the dependencies, and there's our new section, Bootiful Go Long. If I hit generate, hit update dependencies, that gets added to this. I can then hit generate, and you can see that's downloading a new zip file. What did we call this? We called this, I guess this demo. So open this one. And what does this file look like? Alright, so there you go. You can see it says st.numbers autoconfigure. The issue, of course, is that I haven't specified the version. It is assumed that you have attached to your dependency here a bill of materials dependency that would then get registered automatically in your dependency management section. So the version would be specified in that bill of materials, and so you should also create one of those. A bill of materials is merely a dependency that has a dependency management section that and it looks kind of like our bill of materials for Spring Boot, right? We've got one as well. So there's documentation on how to do that as well. But you can see how this would work, right? You add this, and you then tie that dependency here to a, let's see, BOM. Right? So you can see that sometimes these dependencies reference a BOM name, right? And the BOM is a thing. Where's the BOM dependencies, definitions? Whoa. Okay. There you go, initializer, BOMs, right? So if you want any of the Azure dependencies, they will specify that my BOM is equal to Azure, and then when that gets specified, then this gets added to your Maven build. It'll say, I'm going to automatically add in the dependency management section, call Microsoft Azure, Azure Spring Boot BOM, Azure.version, and if you're using Spring Boot 1.5.4 to 2.0, then you'll get the Azure BOM 024, and if you're using Spring Boot 2.10 release, then you'll get 2.12, etc. So this logic tells, Spring Boot is automatically smart enough to know, okay, you want the version of this BOM that matches the version of Spring Boot, and we expect that to be maintained, and you should do the same for your organization, okay? So with that, we have our own custom initializer. We could customize this to our heart's content, of course, and you can reskin it and change it and so on. And by the way, we have people that work on this full time, right? There's a team of people that work on the initializer. So we're always keen on getting feedback. If you want to contribute back, if you have a big idea, it's an open source project. We're happy to hear from you. One thing, this is a pretty trivial demo. I think we can all agree on that. Same thing for my auto configuration, right? But my auto configuration, I've customized it, I've formatted it. I'm using IntelliJ, right? So if I do this, let's just get rid of all this, collapse it all together like that. Okay. There's my formatting. Is that a good formatting? Do we appreciate that I checked in the code like this, with no spaces, right? Just like that. I used VI or something like that, and I didn't care about spacing. I don't think that's very good. I don't think that's very nice. I don't think people are gonna like that. So I might do Command Alt L on the Mac for IntelliJ, and Command Alt L will automatically format the code. But what about the people using Eclipse or NetBeans? What about their code formatters? What if they then reformat the code to be to their liking in that environment? Is that going to be good? Do we want that result? And do we want to check that in? That means that when somebody looks at the code, the only thing that's going to be different from one environment to the other is the formatting, which is a not great thing, right? It's going to give you the perception that something has changed when in point of fact something has not. And what about my choice of lines here? I've wrapping like this, right? And I want things like that. You know, I want multiple annotations on the same line. Do you like that? Is that, you know, does that make you feel better about your trust in me, your confidence in me that I've done this to your code? So again, you can't, you know, the nice thing about Spring Boot is that there is no particular IDE requirement. It's just anything that supports Java 8 and Maven or Gradle. And as a result, you have full latitude in doing, you know, complete latitude, you know, using whatever tooling you want, and you're sort of up to the whims of whatever IDE the person editing code is using at that point, right? And so one thing that we want is for people to not focus on this kind of stuff, just not worry about it. So there's a nice tool that we developed for our own uses, and which I, Josh, am also using for my books. I've used it for the Reactive Spring book just extensively. So all my code uses this tool. It's called Spring Java Format. So okay, Spring Java Format, and it's under Spring.io, Spring-Java Format, and in order to use it, you just add this plugin to your build. Okay, actually, better yet, let's do this. Okay, so I'm going to go to my build in my auto configuration here, and I'll go to the build section. And again, you might have an organizational dependency that requires this get added automatically to all the builds. Okay. Oops. So we'll add this here. Cool. So now we've got Spring.io Java. We've got IO Spring Java Format, Spring Java Format Maven plugin, and we go here. And now let's just try and do Maven clean package on my code. Let's see what happens. Look at that. It wouldn't even compile, right? It's upset. It says Spring. You have to run Spring Java Format apply because these things don't match the formatting expectations of the organization of my project. So I say Maven Spring Java Format apply. Okay. Now let's go look at our code. Right there it is. There. You can see it's been reformatted the way that the Spring Boot team uses for their code, right? Now, of course, I still don't like that route is on the same line as Git, right? So you can do that, right? And this is, you got wrapped to another line, so that might be a clue to you and me that this should be extracted out into a lambda, maybe, or a method reference or something, right? Do what you can to make that code easier because you're at the whims of this reformatter. So let's now see. Okay. Body. So do I like that? Am I okay with that? Let's see what happens. Oh, it's actually in the ID, isn't it? Okay, so you can see it got wrapped to the new line, but it's better. Right, so you can see that because I did this, it was forced to preserve it on the next line. This got wrapped back, so now I can add that there. One more time. Okay, so you can see it does a very good job. Behind the scenes, this engine is using the Eclipse formatter, or at least I think it was. At least it was at one point. And so we're actually using the Eclipse formatter, and we're formatting our code in a consistent way. So now there's no question about what the right formatting is. There's just one kind of formatting. Let's just agree, tab spaces, whatever. It's already taken care of for us. Don't worry about it. Just work on the code that matters to you, right? And it'll actually break the build. So it forces people to get in the habit of applying Maven Spring Java Format : apply, right? So now all things being equal, assuming everything else is valid, I can do Maven clean package. And my build is correct. Let's say I go here and do that and that. Now what happens? Right? It's telling me this file no longer matches formatting expectations. So we do Maven Spring Java format clean package. And I like to do that because that makes it so that when I test my local code, I format it first, then I run the tests. And that way, if it passes, it's passed everything, and I can just commit it, and it goes to the CI environment. Okay. So there we go. We've looked at a number of different things you can use to ensure you've got consistency. We didn't get a chance to look at the details of creating a starter and creating a bill of materials dependency. That's well documented in the documentation. There are wikis and things like that, but you should know that that's a thing you should do. That's what I want you to know, because then that lets you disseminate your dependencies throughout the organization. And one great way to do that is through the Spring Initializer. And the Spring Initializer allows people to access consistently your auto configuration. Remember, you can specify that certain dependencies be added to all projects generated by your organization. So maybe that security auto configuration that we hinted at earlier, maybe you have that as a required dependency. Every project generated on your custom Spring Initializer must have this dependency, just like the test libraries in Spring Boot are automatically added no matter what. There's no way to opt out of that, right? This can help ensure organizational standards. It helps ensure consistency. You can also customize the Maven build. You could add this Maven Spring Java format plugin, for example, or you could make sure that all the projects are seeded at a particular parent dependency instead of ours, right? So you can do some really interesting things, and now you have a central place to do this. You could also add support for creating, Cloud Foundry files or Docker containers or whatever. You can add the Maven Jib plugin, right? Lots of good options. I hope you'll give all this stuff a go. I think all of this stuff is pretty cool. I don't know how many people know about the Spring Java format plugin. I really like it. It's one of the nice things about Go, the Go language, is that there's something called Go format, GOFMT, and it just takes away the pain of like, is this the right way, right? Python is very sensitive to space as well, and it just takes away the pain of like, is this, tabs or spaces? Who cares? Just write software. Let's get it to production. Don't worry about that, right? It looks the same. It works the same. The Maven Spring Java format plugin has very little in the way of opportunities for reformatting or for customization. That's the whole point. It is to be the house style, right? It just takes away any discussion of, is this the right way? Let's just focus on writing software, right? Let's not fight about this, that, or the rest. It's arbitrary. All right. Thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you got something out of it. And as usual, we'll see you next time.